June 5, 1944. The night air hung heavy with anticipation as Major John Howard stood among his men at RAF Tarrant Rushton Airfield in Dorset, England. The 181 soldiers of D Company, 2nd Battalion, Oxfordshire and Buckinghamshire Light Infantry, were about to embark on what would become one of the most daring and precise military operations in history. 6 Horsa gliders waited on the runway, their massive wooden frames gleaming faintly in the dim light. Unlike conventional aircraft, these behemoths carried no engines. They would be towed across the English Channel by Halifax bombers before being released to silently descend upon their targets in occupied France. What these men couldn't know as they climbed aboard was that their silent arrival would create a moment of such profound shock among German commanders that it would forever change how military strategists viewed airborne operations. The shock of seeing British troops suddenly materialize beside critical defensive positions would paralyze German response at the exact moment when quick reaction might have changed the course of history. Major Hans Schmidt, commander of the German forces defending the vital Bénouville Bridge over the Caen Canal, was enjoying drinks with his French girlfriend that evening. He had been repeatedly assured by his superiors that this bridge, later to be renamed Pegasus Bridge, was one of the 2 most important strategic points in Normandy. Yet, despite this knowledge, Schmidt remained utterly unprepared for what was about to unfold. The Germans had constructed elaborate defenses, including machine gun emplacements, bunkers, and anti-tank positions, but all were oriented toward conventional ground attacks coming from the east. No one had seriously considered the possibility of precision airborne assault landing directly on top of the objective. At precisely 22:56, the Halifax bombers began their takeoff sequence, the massive Horsa gliders in tow. Each Horsa carried nearly 30 fully armed men, along with equipment and supplies. At 67 feet long with an 88-foot wingspan, these wooden behemoths were essentially flying troop carriers designed for one-way journeys into combat. They represented a revolutionary approach to battlefield insertion, one that would demonstrate how industrial ingenuity could shatter ideological certainty. The Germans had repeatedly been told that Allied airborne capabilities were limited and inaccurate. This belief was so ingrained in their defensive planning that when the impossible appeared before their eyes in the early minutes of June 6th, many German soldiers would initially refuse to trust their own senses. It was perhaps the perfect illustration of how abundance of resources and industrial might could produce military capabilities that seemed to defy the very laws of physics to those on the receiving end. As the night deepened toward midnight, the fate of thousands hung in the delicate balance of what would happen in the next few hours. The Germans slept, unaware that silent predators were already airborne, about to fundamentally challenge everything they thought they knew about modern warfare. The night of June 5th into the early morning of June 6th, 1944, marked the beginning of Operation Overlord, the Allied invasion of Normandy. While most people associate D-Day with the massive amphibious landings on beaches codenamed Omaha, Utah, Gold, Juno, and Sword, the first Allied troops to touch French soil arrived not by sea, but from the air. Their mission, Operation Dead Stick, would become a textbook example of precision and surprise in military history, demonstrating how industrial might could create tactical advantages that seemed almost supernatural to the enemy. The German defensive strategy for the Atlantic Wall, created under Field Marshal Erwin Rommel's direction, focused primarily on repelling attacks from the sea. The Germans had fortified the coastline with concrete bunkers, artillery batteries, machine gun nests, and extensive minefields. Their planning assumed that any airborne operations would be scattered and disorganized, with troops widely dispersed and unable to concentrate force quickly enough to threaten key positions before German reserves could respond. This assumption was based partly on technical limitations the Germans believed were insurmountable. Landing large numbers of paratroopers with precision was difficult, and previous operations had shown that drops often scattered men across wide areas. Glider insertions were considered even more problematic. The Germans believed it nearly impossible to land gliders with sufficient accuracy to directly threaten specific tactical targets. Their own experiences with the DFS-230 glider had shown both the promise and limitations of such operations. What the Germans failed to account for was the industrial scale at which the Allies had embraced airborne warfare. By June 1944, over 3,600 Horsa gliders had been produced, primarily by furniture manufacturers and other woodworking companies throughout Britain. This mass production approach allowed for extensive training and operational refinement that the Germans simply couldn't match as their industrial base crumbled under strategic bombing. The scale of Allied airborne preparations was staggering. The British 6th Airborne Division alone would deploy more than 320 Horsa gliders in the first wave of Operation Tonga, with another 296 participating in the second lift. Each of these massive wooden aircraft could deliver 28 fully armed troops or smaller numbers along with vehicles and heavy equipment, a concentration of force that German planning had dismissed as logistically impossible. For Major Hans Schmidt, the night of June 5th had been unremarkable. Intelligence reports had mentioned possible Allied operations, but there was nothing specific pointing to his sector. The bridges he was responsible for defending, spanning the Caen Canal and the Orne River, were considered vulnerable primarily to sabotage or conventional ground assault, not precision airborne attack. His defenses were arranged accordingly, with machine guns and bunkers oriented toward approaches from the east, where any ground attack would logically originate. The entire German defensive posture in Normandy reflected a fundamental miscalculation about Allied capabilities and intentions, a miscalculation rooted in their inability to comprehend the industrial scale at which Britain and America were operating. German commanders simply could not believe that the Allies could produce enough specialized aircraft and train enough pilots to conduct the kind of operation that was about to unfold. At approximately 6,000 feet over the French coast, Staff Sergeant Jim Walwork pulled the release mechanism that separated his Horsa glider from its Halifax tow plane. The night was clear, but the descent was rapid and unnerving. Without engines, the only sound inside the glider was the rush of air and the occasional creaking of the wooden frame. Major Howard sat tensely behind the pilots, fully aware that the success or failure of the entire D-Day operation might hinge on what happened in the next few minutes. Walwork had been briefed to land as close as possible to the Bénouville Bridge, ideally with the nose of his glider breaking through the perimeter wire to provide immediate access to the objective. This level of precision seemed nearly impossible, especially in darkness, but Walwork was determined to deliver Howard's men exactly where they needed to be. The German sentries at the bridge heard the distant drone of aircraft, but this was not unusual. Allied bombing raids were frequent, and the sound of planes passing overhead rarely warranted special attention. What happened next, however, defied their expectations completely. At 16 minutes past midnight on June 6, 1944, the impossible occurred. 3 Horsa gliders appeared out of the darkness and crashed to earth less than 50 yards from the Bénouville Bridge. The lead glider, piloted by Walwork and carrying Major Howard, skidded to a violent stop just 47 yards from the bridge. The impact was so severe that both pilots were thrown through the cockpit windscreen, but they had accomplished what many had considered impossible, delivering Howard's assault force precisely on target in complete darkness. The German guards initially believed they were witnessing a bomber crash. In the confusion of those first crucial moments, they failed to recognize that an assault was underway. This misinterpretation, rooted in their inability to conceive of such a precise glider insertion, gave Howard's men the vital seconds they needed to exit their damaged gliders and form up for the attack. The shock experienced by the German defenders in those moments cannot be overstated. They had been told repeatedly that such operations were beyond Allied capabilities. Their defensive preparations reflected this belief, with minimal forces oriented toward the western approaches to the bridge. When Howard's men burst from their gliders and began their assault, the Germans were caught in a devastating position of tactical and psychological disadvantage. Lieutenant Den Brotheridge led the charge across the bridge, firing a Bren gun from the hip. The Germans, still struggling to comprehend what was happening, offered disorganized resistance. Within minutes, Howard's men had secured the western end of the bridge. At almost the same moment, additional gliders were landing near the Ranville Bridge over the Orne River, where a similar assault was underway. For the German defenders, the psychological impact of the attack was as significant as its tactical effect. They had been confronted with a capability they had been told was impossible. Precision airborne insertion directly onto a strategic objective. The carefully constructed narrative about Allied limitations had been shattered in a single shocking moment. Major Schmidt, upon hearing the commotion, assumed there had been a training accident or false alarm. He ordered his driver to take him to the bridge immediately. In a moment that perfectly captured the confusion of the German response, Schmidt's staff car drove directly onto the bridge where he was promptly taken prisoner by Howard's men. The German commander, responsible for what had been identified as one of the most important positions in Normandy, had been captured without firing a shot. So complete was the surprise achieved by the glider assault. By 12:21 in the morning, barely 5 minutes after the first glider had touched down, the western end of the canal bridge was secured. 7 minutes later, Lieutenant Sweeney reported that the Orne River Bridge had also been captured intact. Howard instructed his radio operator to transmit the success codes, HAM for the canal bridge and JAM for the river bridge, signaling that both objectives had been secured with minimal casualties and were ready for use by Allied forces. The strategic implications of this achievement were enormous. The bridges provided the only route by which the British forces landing at Sword Beach could link up with the paratroopers of the 6th Airborne. Had the Germans destroyed these bridges, the entire eastern flank of the Allied invasion might have collapsed. Instead, in less than 10 minutes, a company-sized force had secured objectives that an entire German battalion had failed to defend. The impact of the operation on German morale extended far beyond the immediate tactical situation. Word quickly spread among German units that the Allies had somehow managed to land gliders with pinpoint accuracy directly on top of defended positions. This revelation undermined confidence in German defensive preparations throughout Normandy. If the Allies could land troops with such precision directly on the Bénouville Bridge, what other positions might be similarly vulnerable? For the next 12 hours, Howard's men would face increasingly desperate German counterattacks as the enemy tried to recapture the bridges. Tank units from the 21st Panzer Division were ordered to respond, but confusion in the German command structure delayed their deployment. When they finally arrived, they encountered determined resistance from Howard's men, who used Piat anti-tank weapons and well-positioned machine guns to hold their ground. The Germans could not comprehend how a small force of airborne troops, inserted by what they had considered an inherently inaccurate delivery method, had managed to seize and hold such critical objectives. The psychological advantage gained through the shock of the initial assault continued to influence German decision-making throughout the day, causing hesitation and uncertainty at exactly the moment when decisive action might have changed the outcome. As dawn broke on June 6th, Howard's men continued to hold both bridges against mounting pressure. The surprise of their arrival had given them a crucial advantage, but they were increasingly isolated and outgunned. Relief would eventually arrive in the form of Lord Lovat's commandos, who fought their way inland from Sword Beach to reach the airborne troops holding the bridges. Their arrival secured what Howard and his glider-borne troops had accomplished through one of the most audacious and precisely executed operations of the war. The Horsa gliders that had delivered Howard's men lay broken in the fields around the bridges, their wooden frames shattered by the force of landing. Yet they had accomplished something remarkable, delivering combat troops exactly where they needed to be at exactly the right moment, achieving complete surprise against a defended position. It was a capability the Germans had believed impossible, and their failure to anticipate it had cost them control of critical terrain at the most decisive moment of the invasion. 20 miles west of the Bénouville and Rainville bridges, another German commander was experiencing an equally shocking revelation. Major General Wilhelm Falle, commanding the 91st Infantry Division, responsible for defending the western section of the invasion area, had been attending a war game exercise at Rennes when reports of airborne landings began to come in. Rushing back to his headquarters near Saint-Côme-du-Mont, Falle's staff car encountered American paratroopers from the 82nd Airborne Division. In the ensuing firefight, one of the highest-ranking German officers in Normandy was killed before he could organize any meaningful response to the Allied landings. Falle's death highlighted another aspect of the psychological impact of the Allied airborne operations. German commanders suddenly found themselves fighting not just on the beaches, where they had expected the main attack, but deep inside what they had considered secure rear areas. The presence of American paratroopers miles inland, combined with the precision British glider landings at key bridges, created an atmosphere of confusion and vulnerability that paralyzed German response during the critical early hours of the invasion. The German High Command had been caught completely unprepared for the scale and precision of Allied airborne operations. They had expected scattered drops of limited effectiveness. Instead, they faced more than 20,000 paratroopers and glider troops landing across Normandy, seizing key positions and disrupting communications. The psychological impact of this unexpected threat forced German commanders to hold back reserves that might otherwise have been committed to counterattacks against the beach landings. For the soldiers and pilots who participated in these operations, the experience was equally transformative. Staff Sergeant Jim Walwork, whose precision flying had delivered Howard's men to the Bénouville Bridge, would later recall, "We were dead on time and dead on target, and saw the French coast in plenty of time to get set. That was when the singing stopped and the silent flight started." And that was when 6 Horsas tiptoed quietly into 2 little fields in Normandy, releasing 180 fighting men in full battle order to give the German garrison the surprise of their lives. The surprise experienced by those German garrisons was the product of a fundamental miscalculation about Allied capabilities, a miscalculation rooted in the inability to comprehend the industrial scale at which Britain and America were operating. The Germans had dismissed precision glider operations as beyond Allied capabilities. Yet, in the early hours of D-Day, they found themselves confronted with exactly such operations, executed with a level of skill and accuracy they had believed impossible. As dawn broke over Normandy on June 6, 1944, the landscape was dotted with hundreds of Horsa gliders. Their shattered wooden frames marked landing zones where Allied troops had arrived with a level of precision that German commanders had failed to anticipate. These broken gliders represented not just a tactical achievement, but a triumph of industrial production and technical training that had fundamentally altered the battlefield equation. The German failure to anticipate the scale and effectiveness of Allied airborne operations stemmed from several factors. First was a tendency to project their own limitations onto their opponents. Germany's glider program had been limited by resource constraints and bombing of production facilities. They simply could not imagine the scale at which Britain was producing aircraft like the Horsa. Over 3,600 of these massive gliders were manufactured during the war, many by furniture companies whose woodworking expertise was repurposed for the war effort. Second was an ideological blindness that prevented German commanders from fully appreciating Allied industrial capabilities. The Nazi regime had consistently underestimated what they viewed as the decadent democracies, failing to recognize that these societies could mobilize resources on a scale that Germany simply could not match. The appearance of hundreds of precision-landed gliders across Normandy forced German commanders to confront this reality in the most dramatic way possible. For Major Hans Schmidt, captured at the Bénouville Bridge in the early minutes of June 6th, this revelation came too late. He had been told his position was critically important, yet had failed to consider the possibility of a precision airborne assault directly onto his objective. Like many German officers, he had placed his faith in conventional defenses against conventional attacks, only to find himself confronted with an approach that bypassed these preparations entirely. The German defenders at the Merville Battery experienced a similar shock. This coastal artillery position, capable of firing on Sword Beach, was assaulted by elements of the 9th Parachute Battalion in another operation that demonstrated the precision of Allied airborne capabilities. Though the British paratroopers suffered heavy casualties and encountered numerous difficulties, they successfully neutralized the battery before the seaborne landings began. The German gunners, like their counterparts at the bridges, found themselves under attack from a direction they had not adequately prepared to defend. Throughout the Normandy countryside, the pattern repeated itself. German units that had prepared to repel attackers coming from the beaches suddenly found themselves engaged with Allied troops who had appeared behind their lines, disrupting communications and seizing key terrain. The psychological impact of this unexpected threat created paralysis in the German command structure precisely when decisive leadership was most needed. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, who had been instrumental in strengthening coastal defenses, was not even in Normandy when the invasion began. He had returned to Germany for his wife's birthday, believing that poor weather made an Allied landing unlikely. This absence at the critical moment further complicated German response to the unexpected airborne threat. By the time Rommel returned to his command post on the evening of June 6th, the Allied foothold in Normandy was already secure. The German 7th Army, responsible for defending Normandy, found itself fighting in multiple directions simultaneously. Rather than concentrating force against the beach landings, units had to be diverted to contain airborne troops who had seized bridges, crossroads, and other key terrain. This dispersion of effort, combined with communications disrupted by both airborne operations and Allied bombing, prevented the Germans from mounting the kind of coordinated counterattack that might have threatened the invasion. For the Allied planners who had conceived and organized the airborne operations, the success achieved on June 6th vindicated their faith in the capabilities of glider-borne troops. Despite the risks and technical challenges involved, operations like the capture of Pegasus Bridge demonstrated that precision insertion directly onto an objective was possible and could achieve results that conventional approaches could not match. The success of the British glider operations was matched by American achievements in the western part of the invasion area. The 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions, though more scattered in their landings than their British counterparts, successfully disrupted German responses and secured key terrain that facilitated the expansion of the Utah Beach lodgment. Their presence miles behind German coastal defenses created confusion and uncertainty that benefited the entire Allied operation. As Lord Lovett's commandos fought their way inland from Sword Beach to link up with Howard's men at the bridges, they completed the connection between the seaborne and airborne elements of the invasion. This junction, achieved by midday on June 6th, secured the eastern flank of the Allied beachhead and prevented German armored units from isolating the paratroopers. It represented the fulfillment of the strategic vision that had guided the planning of the airborne operations. The bridges themselves, captured intact in those first shocking minutes of June 6th, would prove critical to Allied operations in the days that followed. Tanks, artillery, and supplies flowed across them to support the expansion of the beachhead, while German counterattacks were channeled into predictable approaches that could be more effectively countered. The strategic value of what Howard's men had accomplished in those first 10 minutes became increasingly apparent as the battle for Normandy developed. For the German defenders, the lessons of that night were both tactical and psychological. They had prepared for one type of battle only to find themselves fighting another, one in which the advantages of prepared positions and interior lines were negated by the sudden appearance of enemy forces in unexpected locations. The shock of those initial glider landings, so precise and so completely surprising, continued to influence German perceptions throughout the Normandy campaign. Major John Howard would later be awarded the Distinguished Service Order for his leadership in the operation. His men received numerous decorations for their actions that night, including the first Victoria Cross awarded on D-Day to Lieutenant Den Brotheridge, who was fatally wounded leading the charge across the bridge. For their part in delivering Howard's men precisely on target, glider pilots like Jim Walwork received the Distinguished Flying Medal, recognition of the crucial role their skill had played in the operation's success. The Horsa gliders that had made it all possible were abandoned where they had landed, their one-way journey complete. Built primarily of wood and fabric, they represented a remarkable achievement in wartime production. Thousands of these massive aircraft manufactured despite material shortages and bombing, each capable of delivering nearly 30 fully equipped troops directly onto an objective. Their wooden frames would eventually rot away, but the impact of their arrival in Normandy would endure in military planning for generations. In the years following the war, the bridge at Bénouville was renamed Pegasus Bridge in honor of the airborne forces who had captured it. The shoulder patch of the British airborne forces featured the mythological flying horse Pegasus, a fitting symbol for troops who had descended from the sky to achieve one of the most remarkable feats of arms in military history. Today, the original bridge stands in a memorial park near its former location, preserving the memory of those first crucial minutes of D-Day. For military planners around the world, the lessons of Operation Dead Stick and the other airborne operations of D-Day would prove influential in shaping future doctrine. The value of precision insertion directly onto an objective had been demonstrated beyond question, as had the psychological impact of unexpected threats appearing behind prepared defenses. Airborne operations would remain a key element of military planning throughout the Cold War and beyond, their utility confirmed by what Howard's men had accomplished at Pegasus Bridge. Perhaps the most enduring legacy of those operations was the demonstration of how industrial might could be translated into tactical advantage. The thousands of Horsa gliders produced by Britain represented a level of resource commitment that Germany could not match. Their appearance over Normandy in the early hours of June 6th forced German commanders to confront the reality that their opponents could achieve what they themselves could not, a reality that would be reinforced many times over as the Allied material advantage increasingly dominated the battlefield. For the German officers who experienced the shock of those first glider landings, it was a moment of revelation, one that challenged fundamental assumptions about what was possible in modern warfare. The precision delivery of combat troops directly onto their objectives, achieving complete surprise against prepared positions, represented a capability they had dismissed as beyond their enemy's reach. In that moment of shock and disbelief, as wooden giants appeared silently out of the darkness, the future of warfare was revealed. The scene at the Merville Battery in the early hours of June 6th illustrates this transformation perfectly. German gunners manning what they believed to be a secure position suddenly found themselves under attack by British paratroopers who had appeared as if by magic in their midst. The battery, which might have inflicted heavy casualties on troops landing at Sword Beach, was instead neutralized before the seaborne assault began, its guns silenced by men who had dropped from the sky. Lieutenant Colonel Terence Otway, commanding the 9th Parachute Battalion tasked with assaulting the Merville Battery, faced enormous challenges when his force was scattered during the drop. Gathering only 150 of his original 750 men, Otway nonetheless pressed ahead with the attack. The German defenders, caught completely by surprise, were overwhelmed despite their prepared positions and numerical advantage. The psychological impact of the airborne assault, troops appearing unexpectedly within their perimeter, negated the physical advantages of their fortified position. Similar scenes played out across Normandy as Allied airborne troops disrupted German defensive preparations at dozens of locations. Each successful action reinforced the psychological advantage gained through surprise and demonstrated the value of precision insertion against key objectives. For German commanders trying to organize a coherent response to the invasion, the presence of thousands of Allied troops behind their lines created a paralysis of decision-making that proved fatal to their defensive efforts. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, Commander-in-Chief West, found himself unable to react effectively to the multiple threats presented by the Allied operation. The airborne landings had so thoroughly disrupted his command and control systems that coordinating a counterattack against the beach landings became nearly impossible. By the time some measure of organization had been restored, the Allied beachhead was firmly established and the opportunity for a decisive German response had passed. The bridges at Bénouville and Ranville, secured in those first shocking minutes of June 6th, would serve as the lifeline connecting the British airborne forces to the troops pushing inland from Sword Beach. Their capture intact represented not just a tactical success, but a strategic victory that shaped the entire eastern flank of the Allied invasion. Had the Germans destroyed these bridges, as they had prepared to do, the 6th Airborne Division might have found itself isolated and vulnerable to counterattack. Instead, the bridges became the conduit through which reinforcements and supplies flowed to support the expanding Allied presence east of the Orne. German armored units that might have threatened the Sword Beach lodgment were forced to take circuitous routes to avoid these crossing points, delaying their arrival at the battlefield and reducing their effectiveness when they did engage. The strategic vision that had guided the planning of Operation Dead Stick was vindicated by these outcomes. For the men who experienced those first moments of D-Day, the memories would remain vivid for the rest of their lives. Jim Walwork, whose precision flying had delivered Howard's men to Pegasus Bridge, would recall decades later the silence that descended as his glider cast off from its tow plane and began its descent toward the objective. That silence, broken only by the rush of air and the creaking of the wooden frame, was what made the operation possible. It allowed the gliders to approach undetected, achieving the complete surprise that was essential to success. Major John Howard would remember the moment when his glider crashed to earth near the bridge, the violent impact throwing both pilots through the windscreen, but delivering his assault force precisely where they needed to be. The speed with which his men recovered from the crash and formed up for the attack was testimony to their training and determination. Within minutes, they were charging across the bridge, overwhelming German defenders who were still struggling to comprehend what was happening. For the German sentries who witnessed the arrival of Howard's men, it was a moment of disbelief. They had been told that such operations were beyond Allied capabilities, that precision airborne insertions directly onto an objective were impossible. Yet here were enemy troops appearing out of nowhere, emerging from wooden giants that had descended silently from the night sky. The shock of that moment, the realization that what they had been told was impossible was happening before their eyes, paralyzed their response in the critical seconds when effective action might have made a difference. The capture of Pegasus Bridge would become one of the most celebrated actions of D-Day, immortalized in books, films, and military studies. It represented the perfect execution of a high-risk operation, achieving results that conventional approaches could not have matched. The precision of the glider landings, placing assault troops within yards of their objective in complete darkness, demonstrated capabilities that would influence military planning for generations to come. For the German commanders who experienced the shock of the Allied airborne operations, it was a moment of reckoning, a confrontation with capabilities they had dismissed as beyond their enemy's reach. The appearance of thousands of Allied troops behind their lines, delivered by aircraft they could not intercept, and arriving at locations they had not adequately prepared to defend, created a crisis of confidence that undermined their entire defensive strategy. Field Marshal Rommel, returning to his command post on the evening of June 6th, found a situation far different from what he had anticipated. The defenses he had labored to strengthen had been bypassed by airborne operations of unprecedented scale and precision. The forces he had positioned to repel the invasion were disorganized and confused, struggling to respond to threats appearing in unexpected locations. The strategic initiative had been seized by the Allies in those first crucial hours, and regaining it would prove impossible. The wooden frames of the Horsa gliders, broken and abandoned across the Normandy countryside, stood as silent testimony to what had been accomplished. Each represented the successful delivery of troops and equipment directly onto objectives that conventional approaches would have found difficult or impossible to reach. Collectively, they demonstrated a level of industrial production and technical proficiency that Germany simply could not match, a material advantage that would increasingly dominate the battlefield as the war continued. For the Allied planners who had conceived and organized the airborne operations, the successes achieved on June 6th validated years of development and training. Despite skepticism from some quarters about the feasibility of large-scale airborne operations, the results achieved in Normandy demonstrated their value beyond question. The psychological impact of troops appearing behind enemy lines, the disruption of command and control systems, and the seizure of key terrain before the main assault all contributed to the overall success of the invasion. The Horsa gliders themselves represented a remarkable achievement in wartime production. Designed to be built primarily of wood to conserve scarce metal resources, they were manufactured by companies with woodworking expertise, furniture makers, cabinet builders, and similar firms whose capabilities were repurposed for the war effort. This approach allowed for mass production on a scale that would have been impossible using conventional aircraft manufacturing techniques. Each Horsa required approximately 370 cubic feet of wood, primarily birch, pine, and spruce. The fuselage was constructed in sections to facilitate transportation and final assembly near the departure airfields. This modular approach allowed production to be distributed across multiple facilities, reducing vulnerability to bombing and maximizing the use of available resources. By June 1944, over 3,600 of these massive gliders had been produced. The scale of this production effort was matched by the training program for the pilots who would fly them into combat. The glider pilot regiment combined the skills of aviators with the fighting capabilities of infantry. Each pilot was expected to serve as a combat soldier once on the ground. This dual role required extensive training in both flying and fighting, creating a unique force that was both delivery system and combat element. For the German defenders who experienced the shock of the Allied airborne assault, it was a moment that challenged fundamental assumptions about their enemy's capabilities. They had been told that precision airborne insertions were beyond Allied abilities, that mass production of specialized aircraft was constrained by resource limitations, that trained pilots for such operations were in short supply. Yet in the early hours of June 6th, they found themselves confronted with an operation that defied all these expectations. The psychological impact of this revelation extended far beyond the immediate tactical situation. German commanders suddenly had to question other assumptions about Allied capabilities and intentions. If they had been so wrong about the feasibility of precision glider operations, what other misconceptions might be guiding their decision-making? This uncertainty contributed to the paralysis of German response during the critical early hours of the invasion. For the men who participated in these operations, both Allied and German, It was a transformative experience, one that would shape their understanding of warfare for the rest of their lives. The British and American troops who descended on Normandy by parachute and glider demonstrated courage and determination in executing high-risk missions against defended positions. The German defenders, confronted with capabilities they had been told were impossible, found themselves fighting a battle for which they were psychologically unprepared. The broken Horsa gliders, scattered across the Normandy countryside on the morning of June 6th, stood as symbols of this transformation, physical evidence of capabilities that had been dismissed as beyond reach. Each represented not just the delivery of troops and equipment, but a fundamental challenge to assumptions about what was possible in modern warfare. Their silent arrival in the darkness had announced a new reality that would shape the battlefield for generations to come. Today, the legacy of those operations lives on in military planning and doctrine worldwide. The value of precision insertion directly onto an objective, the psychological impact of unexpected threats appearing in secure areas, and the importance of challenging conventional assumptions about enemy capabilities. All these lessons, demonstrated so dramatically in the early hours of D-Day, continue to influence how modern forces approach complex operations. The bridge at Bénouville, renamed Pegasus Bridge to honor the men who captured it, stands as a memorial to what was accomplished in those first crucial minutes of the invasion. The original structure, replaced by a larger modern bridge in 1994, has been preserved in a nearby memorial park along with a replica of a Horsa glider. These artifacts offer physical connection to a moment when the impossible suddenly became possible, when wooden giants descended from the night sky to deliver men who would change the course of history. For the German commanders who experienced the shock of that moment, it was a revelation that came too late. Their failure to anticipate the scale and effectiveness of Allied airborne operations contributed significantly to the overall success of the invasion. By the time they began to comprehend what they were facing, the Allied foothold in Normandy was already secure, and the opportunity for effective counteraction had passed. The thousands of Horsa gliders produced by Britain and delivered to Normandy on June 6th represented not just a tactical achievement, but a triumph of industrial production over ideological certainty. Their appearance over the battlefield forced German commanders to confront a reality they had dismissed as impossible, that their enemies could achieve what they themselves could not. In that moment of revelation, as wooden giants descended silently from the darkness, the future of warfare was unveiled. The psychological impact of these operations extended far beyond the immediate tactical situation. For the German defenders, suddenly confronted with Allied troops appearing where none should have been possible, it created a crisis of confidence that undermined their entire defensive strategy. For Allied planners, the successes achieved validated years of development and training, confirming capabilities that would shape military operations for generations to come. Perhaps the most enduring legacy of those operations is the demonstration of how industrial might can be translated into tactical advantage. The thousands of Horsa gliders produced by Britain, aircraft designed specifically for a single mission, represented a level of resource commitment that Germany could not match. Their appearance over Normandy in the early hours of June 6th announced the arrival of a material advantage that would increasingly dominate the battlefield as the war continued. For the men who flew those gliders and fought those battles, it was a moment when the impossible became possible, when wooden giants descended from the night sky to deliver them precisely where they needed to be. Their courage and determination, combined with industrial production on an unprecedented scale, created capabilities that their enemies had dismissed as beyond reach. In that achievement, they demonstrated how abundance can shatter certainty, and how innovation can transform the battlefield in ways that conventional thinking cannot anticipate. The bridges at Bénouville and Ranville, secured in those first shocking minutes of June 6th, stand as symbols of this transformation, physical evidence of what can be accomplished when courage, determination, and industrial might are combined in pursuit of a clear objective. Their capture, achieved through an operation of unprecedented precision and daring, represents one of the most remarkable feats of arms in military history, a moment when wooden giants descended from the darkness to change the course of history.